All right, everybody. Welcome to tonight's presentation by Karl Hausker on the Inflation Reduction Act and as well as decarbonization. Last month we had a presentation on permaculture. Let me back up. So for those who don't know, MAREA is Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association. We have monthly educational meetings about not only renewable energy, but the topics on ecology, renewable or sustainable living, etc. For example, last month's presentation was bringing permaculture to your home and garden. May was microgrids. April, pollinators. If you plant them, they will come. Related is March, identifying and controlling invasive plants. And then February was personal climate change actions that matter. And I point out that we have, all these past presentations because you can see those presentations. They're all available on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and just do a search on Mid-Atlantic Renewable Energy Association or MAREA, they will come up. There's about 40 videos there now. Upcoming in August, we will be hearing from a professor of ornithology speaking about the issue of, you probably heard of this, bird strikes, birds hitting glass buildings, glass windows, particularly large glass patio doors. Many of you probably experienced that. He'll be talking about that issue and things that can be done to minimize bird deaths. Numbers are astounding how many birds are killed by glass. So that's coming up in August. And then in September, this is tentative, but we're planning on having a combination in-person meeting in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, as well as a Zoom meeting. And it's going to be a presentation on sustainable building practices and renewable energy. Should be very interesting, and we're hoping we can pull that off. So with that, Chuck, you want to introduce tonight's speaker?
Yes, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Karl Hausker, who is the Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute in the Climate Program. He leads analysis and modeling of net zero emission pathways and leads work on electricity for market design. He has worked for 3 decades in the field of climate change, energy, and environment in a career that has spanned legislative and executive branches, research institutions, NGOs, and consulting. So you can see he has quite a breadth of experience related to a topic that is near and dear to our hearts. He served from 1993 to 1995 as the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the EPA's Policy Office. Previously, he served 6 years as the Chief Economist for the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He holds degrees in MPP and PhD in public policy from the University of California at Berkeley, and his undergraduate BA degree in economics from Cornell University. And I've had the pleasure to hear Karl speak in the past at Villanova University, and I know that you will learn a great deal tonight. So without further ado, Karl, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chuck. Really great to have this opportunity to talk with you all. I am going to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and whether the U.S. can get to net zero. I'm going to hopefully make the case that this is truly a visionary law. And what we're going to do is going to briefly review what would net zero emissions really look like. How do we define that? Take a brief history of U.S. climate policy that I think will either make you laugh or cry. And we're going to review the 4 key strategies to achieve a net zero CO2 emissions economy, and then turn to an overview of the IRA climate provisions and how they map to these 4 strategies. Then next, we're going to do a deep dive on one strategy, electricity decarbonization, asking the question, why or why not 100% renewable electricity? Then we'll do a deep dive on carbon capture in its various forms, which some people view as a solution, others view as a problem. I'll stop twice in the middle of this deck, and we'll do some, we'll do 5 minutes or so of some Q&A, so you don't have to listen to me ramble on for too long. I will move fairly fast through some of this material. There's plenty of web links on the slides for you to go deeper, and I'll also be making the presentation available afterwards. So let's dive in. What does it mean to say net emissions, and what does it mean to reach net zero? This graph, probably many of you are familiar with. It's for the United States, and on the y-axis are emissions of greenhouse gases, a million metric tons, and then a timeline from 1990 out to 2020. And as you can imagine, we break it down by sectors: transportation, electricity, industry, agriculture and power sector, agriculture, residential, commercial. Those are, of course, positive emissions from burning fossil fuels and other emissions of greenhouse gases. And then there's actually a source of negative emissions. Right now in the US, through what's happening in our land and our growing forests and some soil sequestration, we're actually taking out about 800 million tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere each year. And so given that we emit about 6,000 tons, we get a net emissions of about 5,200 million metric tons currently. We have a big task ahead of us as a country and as a globe to take net emissions all the way to zero to finally halt global warming. And so that obviously means massive emission cuts, but also increased removals to get down to net zero emissions. So let me turn to a brief history of major U.S. policy. Some of these are actually attempts at a climate policy. And I think it's useful to talk about sticks versus carrots, and I hope you appreciate my cartoon here. Let's go back to 1993. There was a major attempt at a economy-wide stick policy in the form of a BTU tax proposed by President Clinton. It passed the House. It died in the Senate. Go forward 4 more years to the Kyoto Protocol. President Clinton and Vice President Gore helped negotiate the Kyoto Protocol under the International Climate Treaty. It envisioned a stick policy, a cap on emissions and international emissions trading among countries. This protocol was never offered to the Senate because it clearly had no chance at the time of passing the Senate. Flash forward to 2009. In the first 2 years of the Obama administration, the president and the Democrats in Congress proposed, again, a major stick policy, a cap and trade program known as the Waxman-Markey bill. It passed the House. It died in the Senate. Is anyone beginning to see a pattern here? Well, we now flash forward to 2022 and sort of a sea change in the approach here. The Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022. And it's fair to say that it's about 99% carrots, tax incentives, loans, federal procurement, grants, totaling up to an estimated spending of about $370 billion over 10 years. This passed the House narrowly, with the Democrats sort of barely in control by about maybe 5 votes in the House. It did not die in the Senate. Why? Because it was all carrots, essentially. It could be packaged as a budget reconciliation bill. Therefore, it didn't have to achieve 60 votes in the Senate. The vote in the Senate was 50-50 with a tiebreaker by Vice President Harris to pass it by literally 51-50. That tells you a lot about the political economy of climate policy over the last 30 years, for better or worse. Most interesting, too, equally important is that the IRA bill, when you couple it with a bill that passed with bipartisan support, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, sometimes known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and you look also at the CHIPS and Science Act, passed just before the IRA with bipartisan support. Together, these really form a comprehensive research, development, demonstration, and deployment program designed to move some technologies from the lab all the way to commercialization, and for other technologies that are already deployed or already commercialized, move them further and further down the deployment path. There's a nice piece by a group called Third Way that explores how these three bills interact in that RDD&D program. Now, I don't want to overemphasize that we just switched from stick approaches to carrots. There have been a lot of good stick policies in place. They just haven't been comprehensive, and they've helped us make progress in recent years. As many of you know, we've had a long history of appliance efficiency standards, and happy to say they've had pretty good bipartisan support and rarely have been weakened. On the other hand, we have had CAFE standards in place for a long time. We have added recently vehicle emission standards, but sadly, these have seen a lot of flip-flops, particularly across the last three presidents, but they've had an impact. Power plant standards, controls on CO2 emissions from power plants, again, flip-flops proposed by Obama, struck down by a court, vacated by Trump, and then revived by Biden. We have had a bipartisan support for the phase down of HFCs. It's a very important non-CO2 gas. And again, happy to say that, again, every once in a while, a little bit of bipartisan support emerges, and a bill was passed in 2020, and the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol also passed in 2022. These are all important incremental steps affecting certain gases in certain sectors. It's also important to note that we have had some subnational cap and trade. Of course, here in the Northeast, we've had the RGGI program in place for many years, covering CO2 from the power sector. That has helped stabilize and then reduce CO2 emissions in the Northeast. California has a comprehensive GHG emissions trading program covering about 80% of emissions. And of course, we've had state renewable portfolio standards. We've had a federal production tax credit and investment tax credit for solar and wind. And that has helped bend our emissions curve. And we've also, of course, had abundant, low-cost natural gas because of the fracking revolution. And that has helped really back out a lot of coal generation. So that's why that emissions curve that we saw here has started to bend from 2005 downward. So I now want to quickly say what the four key strategies are to getting to net zero CO2 emissions, just leaving aside the non-CO2 gases for a moment. And then we're going to see how visionary the IRA is, how it maps to all four of these. These four strategies are really consistent across all kinds of net zero pathway modeling by the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, International Renewable Energy Agency, and various consulting groups and academic modeling. There you see. These four strategies, I'd actually like to start with energy efficiency. Part of moving to net zero CO2 is to simply become as energy efficient as possible as we can across all of our end uses. Currently, we use about 200 gigajoules of energy per person in the US. We know that with commercial or near commercial technologies, we can cut that by at least a third or more by 2050, get our total energy use down. Second key strategy in the third bar here is electrification. We need to electrify as many end uses as possible, substituting the direct use of electricity for the burning of fossil fuels. Right now, we're at about 20% direct use of electricity. We can hopefully triple that to near 60% over the next 30 years by doing things like electrifying heating of our homes and space heating, water heating. We're, of course, switching to electricity in the transport sector with EVs taking off. And in industry, we can particularly supply a lot of low temperature and mid temperature heat with electricity and switch away from combustion of fossil fuels. The light blue bar here is labeled electric fuels, and as I'm sure you can guess, that's taking electricity and producing zero carbon gaseous or liquid fuels. Electrolysis can produce hydrogen. We can take hydrogen and produce ammonia. We can produce other synthetic fuels from electricity that can supply certain end uses that can't be directly electrified. So that's strategy number 2. And strategy number 3, as you can imagine, we're going to need a whole lot of electricity. Electricity use is probably going to double or triple if we're successful over the next 30 years. And fortunately, we can really decarbonize that. We're currently emitting about 400 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt hour we generate. We can take that down to near zero by 2050. And fortunately, we have lots of options. We have solar, we have wind, hydro, geothermal, nuclear, and we can also capture CO2 emissions, whether we're burning fossil fuels or bioenergy, and turn that also into a zero or near zero emission electricity source. The final strategy is capturing carbon. And that means in certain uses, particularly in the industrial sector, like cement, we don't know other ways to eliminate CO2 emissions, so we will be doing some application of carbon capture and storage. We also may capture some and use it in products that essentially permanently store it. We also will be increasing our forestry and agricultural capture of CO2. And again, there may be a role for CCS in the power sector. Various experts disagree on exactly how much we might need that. So with those 4 key strategies in mind, let's turn to what this sprawling, huge, significant bill does, the Inflation Reduction Act. There are provisions increasing energy efficiency. We have tax credits now for various improvements like insulation, better windows, better doors in our buildings. We have federal investments made in new low-carbon materials for construction and particularly for constructing buildings. On the electrification front, we have new clean vehicle tax credits for both your private EVs that you may be buying, also for commercial vehicles. We have grants for clean heavy-duty vehicles like school buses that are beginning a massive electrification program there. We have tax credits to electrify heat pumps, electric stoves, electric water heaters, etc. And in the area of using electricity to produce a zero carbon fuel, we have a new clean hydrogen production tax credit. And I was just talking with Chuck before we began here. He just was at a webinar saying how this production tax credit is just causing an explosion of plans for hydrogen production around the country. The third strategy, decarbonization, we have a very interesting development where our existing renewable tax credits are going to move to a clean electricity tax credit that is essentially a technology neutral approach by 2025. If you have a zero carbon electricity generation source, you'll be able to choose either an investment or production tax credit to accelerate its deployment. There's also a new nuclear power production tax credit for existing plants. As many of you know, there are a couple of states have seen fit to keep their nuclear plants operating where they're under extreme pressure from wholesale electricity markets. This is now a nationwide PTC to make sure that we can keep our existing nuclear plants operating, which currently produce about 20% of our total power with zero emissions. There's other provisions to promote offshore wind in terms of federal leasing. There's grants to facilitate the planning and construction of new transmission lines, which are essential, particularly to tap into our offshore wind and our rich loads of onshore wind and solar that may be distant from our load centers. And finally, on the carbon capture front and carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, we have a series of enhanced CCS tax credits and also credits for technological CDR like direct air capture. We have new federal investments in biomass, forest management, carbon removal, and other programs that assist farmers to store more carbon in soil through agricultural techniques. So again, the bill is amazing in its breadth and touching on all of these. But there's even more. This bill, as you may know, is not just a climate bill, but it's aims at enhancing U.S. jobs, wages, equity, environmental justice. It has cross-cutting provisions affecting many of the tax incentives that create bonuses for meeting prevailing wage rates, for companies establishing apprentice programs, obviously working with unions in many cases, bonuses for meeting certain domestic content requirements that are leading, among other things, to an explosion of interest in siting battery manufacturing in the U.S. There's an advanced manufacturing production tax credit to spur, again, on home-based manufacturing. When you do a clean energy tax credit, you also get a bonus for projects that are located in what's called energy communities, meaning perhaps a coal community where the plant is shut down, the mine is shut down, and also projects located in disadvantaged and low-income communities. So again, a policy not just aimed at climate, but at improving the equity of our society, and in the field of environmental justice, a big grant program to spur progress in that area. There's also a whole bunch of direct pay and transferability provisions that will expand the type of entities that take advantage of tax credits. You can be a nonprofit. You can be a company that does not have a major tax liability, and you can still take advantage of these. So it's really spreading out the eligibility. There's all the modeling of this bill indicates that it's going to spur jobs. Two examples there that you can dive into. And there's even one notable stick on non-CO2 emissions, in this case, methane emissions for facilities in the oil and gas sector. So it's, again, this is a visionary bill, and it's already spurring a lot of investment and plan investments. So it puts a lot of carrots in place. And but it's also, we have to recognize what Senator Schatz said last year, that we still have obstacles. I love this quote: "The environmental movement of the last generation was partly organized around stopping things, but to save the planet, we are going to have to build things at an unprecedented speed and scale." That requires a whole shift in mindset. And many people are asking, can we build all the needed infrastructure? The pipelines, the transmission lines, the hydrogen electrolyzers, the solar and wind build out, perhaps a new generation of nuclear plants. And here I just have many examples. Ezra Klein has written on this. There's been studies by the Aspen Institute, by Brookings, and others. And my favorite quote here from Brookings: "This unprecedented pace of construction of transmission lines, renewables alone, it's going to be necessary, but we're going to really have to take on the major roadblocks that can spur the siting and permitting. inadequate funding, staffing shortages, and multi-year, multi-agency federal permitting processes. And just as an example, from the Brookings study, they looked at 13 major projects on transmission and renewable generation on something called the Federal Permitting Dashboard. And again, you have some steps that, like Clean Water Act review, that might take a couple years, but you have a right-of-way step administered by BLM that can stretch out to 13 years. NEPA reviews, obviously, is something that has been debated a lot. And in my personal view, yes, there is streamlining and shortening and consolidation we can do that can shorten the time it takes to complete the permitting process without undermining, our basic environmental safeguards. But again, this is a very controversial area. Bottom line, when we look at the modeling of the IRA, here's 6 economy-wide models that show, again, our historic emissions back in 2005, and the target the Biden administration has set of a 50% reduction by 2030. This further, here's our 6 reference cases from 6 modelers that showed us by 2030 only getting into maybe the 25 to 30% range. Looks like the IRA can take us to the 30 to 40% range by 2030 and continue those reductions, but we still have a ways to go if we want to meet the target that the Biden administration has submitted to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there's a lot of uncertainties, of course, on exactly what these incentives are going to do, because it's not a firm regulation. It's not a fixed cap and trade. These are incentives that businesses are going to take advantage of, that consumers are going to take advantage of. And we can't forecast with any certainty. The pending standards the Biden administration has on power plants and vehicles can help bend these a little bit more. But a lot of this will not happen, again, if we cannot permit and site all the infrastructure that we hope this will spur. So I want to stop there just for a second, and not for a second, for a couple minutes before I turn to the deep dives on strategies 3 and 4, and take a few questions.
All right, Joe, do you want to ask your question since you're right there? Joe? Anybody hear me? Joe Macisco wrote a question.
Go ahead, Chuck.
Where's a good online location to find information about tax credits for energy efficient windows, doors, EVs, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think both DOE and EPA have put up websites, and also WRI has a website, and I will make a note to include those in the when I share the deck out.
Okay, can you elaborate on the methane emissions, the aspect in the IRA on an incentive for avoiding methane emissions?
Yeah, where did I put that? Yeah, this was designed to apply to facilities with an excess of 25,000 tons per year of CO2 equivalent. I don't remember off the top of my head how that translates into quantities of methane, but it was designed to apply to oil and gas facilities. As many of you know, there's been attempts to regulate these emissions. There have been voluntary programs trying to get the oil and gas industry to tighten down the leakage of this very powerful greenhouse gas. And for the first time, the IRA puts a fee on those emissions. The facilities will have to measure how much and pay to the federal government a fee. Again, the dollar level I don't have, but again, the links here are good summaries of exact provisions, and also the Congressional Budget Service, Congressional Research Service put out an excellent summary that gives all the details. If I try to keep them all in my head explodes.
No, that's okay. That's okay. If you could add that to your list,
Mhm.
that would be great.
I can get the next one, Chuck, since I found out where I was. I was on a large screen and then I couldn't find how to get myself back on the screen.
Okay.
Anyway, what are the main obstacles to achieving net zero and relative importance of technical, economic, and political?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is also a sprawling question, and I would say first of all, of course, the permitting and siting problem or obstacle is an important one. I've seen estimates that if we do not improve our processes, we could lose anywhere from 50 to 80% of the emission reductions that the IRA would otherwise promise. Prominent researcher there is Jesse Jenkins at Princeton, who has run models sort of with and without the transmission build out in particular that we need. So that would be obstacle number one. I think obstacle number two is just making sure that we get the information out to consumers to take advantage of these incentives on the consumer front. Businesses, of course, particularly large businesses, will be very adept at taking advantage of these, and they have the staff who follow all this. But you move to consumers, you move to smaller or medium-sized businesses. They need the information in hand. They need the outreach to make them aware of how they can take advantage of these tax credits and save money by making certain investments, making certain purchases. The third thing I would say is these incentives have a 10-year life, which is really great because often clean energy incentives in the past have been extended only for a very short number of years. It's very important that the business community and all the end consumers know that these will stay in place, and that we have that business have the confidence. As you've probably seen the news already, the House Republicans are threatening, to roll these back. That won't happen anytime soon, but one can imagine political shifts in 2024, 2026, 2028 that can roll these back under a budget reconciliation bill with a friendly president or friendly Congress. So it's really important that everyone who cares about this maintain the political support to keep them in place.
Thank you.
Maybe take one more if before we move on.
I don't see any other questions here,
Okay,
Carl. So why don't you
All
go
right.
ahead and move
on
on?
we go. Yeah. Broadly speaking, in my opinion, there's very little debate or controversy among climate hawks, climate supporters over the need to improve energy efficiency, over the need to ramp up electrification across many end uses. Although I should note that, not surprisingly, the natural gas industry isn't real excited about massive electrification. That would shrink their market share. And some states, particularly red states, have already making noises that they don't want to go ahead with massive electrification either. But it's particularly in the sort of modeling and policy wonk community. There's a little controversy over those two. So what I'd like to do with my remaining time is delve into two for which there is some debate or controversy. And so the first one we'll look at is electricity decarbonization. And I'd say there is some debate over the role of nuclear the role of carbon capture and storage, say on fossil fuels, and what role that might play in electricity decarbonization to meet that target of going from 400 down to hopefully close to zero. So how do we decarbonize electricity generation? As I'm sure you all know, because I'm speaking to Maria, that there's reasons to be bullish about renewables. This graphic, which you may have seen in the IPCC 6 assessment report, provides very familiar cost trends for solar photovoltaics, wind power on and offshore, concentrated solar power. These are global numbers. You've seen the US numbers, sure, I'm sure, seeing these great cost decreases. And the amazing cost decreases we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years mean that we can envision predominantly renewable grids in the future. However, one stickling point I think it's really important for people to remember, these technologies do not produce energy. They produce electricity. And let's keep that in mind, because there are gaseous fuels, liquid fuels that we also have to think about how to supply. We also have to keep in mind that these cost numbers almost always talk in terms of the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. And that's a simplistic metric that can lead one astray if you don't understand the nuances of that measure of cost. And I think one example of how people can get a little carried away, just from 2022, the United Nations, posted a headline that renewables are now the cheapest form of power. And they're basing that on a report by IRENA. And the head of IRENA said renewables are by far the cheapest form of power today. These are sort of the headline grabbing stuff. I respectfully disagree that that's a good way to characterize where we are. The exact quote deep in this IRENA report is that the global weighted average LCOE of solar and hydropower is now 11% lower than the cheapest fossil fuel options. Onshore wind is 39% lower. But when you dig into this IRENA report, again, with all due respect, you find the caveats that LCOE is just a starting point to analyze the cost of a power system, keeping it reliable and affordable. And one way to sort of go deeper into this is to actually, I pulled out a slide here from Ben Kroposky of NREL. Many of you may have attended his webinar last July, where he also put on a graph here of the levelized cost of electricity for things like utility scale solar, wind, natural gas combined cycle, coal, nuclear, showing the decreases in solar and wind, and showing how by this metric, it looks like solar and wind kind of beat the pants off of everything else. But in his bubble here, when he talked about the plans on really taking the whole system to 100% clean, meaning 100% zero carbon by the US by 2035, it's going to still be a mix. If we keep our 20% nuclear operating, that's going to help. 7% hydro, can't expand that much beyond existing hydro in the US. Probably going to use some hydrogen turbines, maybe some fossil CCS. But yes, we could get to 50, 70%, maybe even ultimately, longer term, maybe higher, but a predominantly wind and solar system. And that's a very important nuance to keep in mind. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is another study, this case by 16 authors from NREL, called The Challenges of Achieving 100% Renewable Electricity System. This came out in 2021 by authors who have devoted their life to advancing renewable electricity technologies. And the key quote here for me is, significant unanswered questions remain regarding moving toward or achieving 100% RE at the national scale. There is no simple answer to how far we can increase renewable penetration before costs rise dramatically or reliability becomes compromised. Why is this? Well, we all know wind and solar are intermittent or variable, to say it more politely, and grid operators must integrate these intermittent sources in ways that keep the lights on 24/7. Those integration steps are not free. There are integration costs, including transmission, building out a much bigger transmission system that aggregates renewables over a bigger geographic area that reduces their collective variability. Integration costs include storage, whether it's pumped hydro or batteries or some of the new innovative storage things. Integration requires demand management, requires shifting load from times of abundant renewables to less abundant renewable production. That is not free either. And also integration costs can be quantified in one way by the phrase overgeneration. Many of the modeling of a heavy renewable system will deliberately involve an overgeneration in certain peak periods to make up for periods of low seasonal generation, say in the winter, where both wind and solar may be a lot less than in summer, particularly solar, of course, for obvious reasons. So all these costs are not included in the LCOE calculation, and they tend to escalate as the renewable penetration grows. And again, the key thing that this NREL study does is illustrate the nonlinear nature of the cost and difficulty of balancing supply and demand. And they sort of talk about three zones. So this qualitative figure in the NREL document has sort of a degree of difficulty or cost on the y-axis, and then an illustration of moving a system of solar and wind from 20, 60, 80, 100%. And right now we're in what I'll label zone 1, 0 to maybe 20, 25, maybe percent or so. We're currently at about 20% total renewables in the US. Renewables are integrated at a very low cost by using existing dispatchable plants, particularly gas, and throwing on some 4-hour batteries, particularly to help with that duck curve. It starts at about 6 p.m. where the sun goes down and woof, we have to really ramp up the power supply. 4-hour batteries help. But as we go beyond 40 into the 60 range, we're into the second zone, which we really have to address what's called the diurnal, the daily mismatch problem when solar disappears for 12 hours roughly. This is going to require storage measured in many hours, not just 4-hour lithium batteries. It's going to require some of the other integration steps to address the diurnal mismatch. And then once we get to 80 or above, we're in what I label zone 3, what they call the seasonal problem, which is largely unsolved at this point. Yeah, we have some technologies, have some pathways, we're doing research, but getting above 80 is going to require long-term storage or other means. Maybe clean firm is going to be what's going to take us through that. Seasonal variation can be huge, and we also must address that wonderful German word, Dunkelflaute, invented by the Germans to describe the 7, 10, 14 days in winter when solar and wind production drop precipitously. And how do you back up the system to get through the Dunkelflautes? One of the other key conclusions of this paper that I commend to you is where the authors say reducing the cost of low carbon generation in the electric sector, potentially by keeping non-renewable options available. This enables electrifying and decarbonizing other sectors, reducing economy-wide carbon emissions. So they are saying, let's keep these other options on the table. We're not sure how much we might have to use them in the future, but we likely will need to deploy them to some level. A very similar message was given in the Sixth Assessment Report by the IPCC. If you turn to Workgroup 3, Chapters 3 and 6, you'll find discussion of the obstacles to trying to move to 100% renewable systems, echoing a lot of what the NREL authors have said. So all this indicates roles for advanced geothermal, which would be a clean, firm power source, dispatchable, controllable. Hydrogen turbines, if we can produce lots of hydrogen, we can burn them in a turbine, but also roles for keeping our existing nuclear plants running, developing advanced nuclear Gen 3, Gen 4 designs, promising small modular reactor designs, which are beginning to pop up both in the US and in other countries. And also, I think one of the most promising carbon capture technologies is called the alum cycle. It's being developed most aggressively by a company called Net Power, and I urge you to check out their website and Google the alum cycle to find a natural gas technology with a front-end pre-combustion technology that allows power production with 100% capture of carbon emissions, no NOx emissions, and essentially no water use. That's a very appealing combination, not only in the US, but overseas, particularly in drought-starved and water-starved countries. To further highlight the need for clean, firm power to complement solar and wind, I would direct your attention to this decision in 2021 by the California PUC, when it was contemplating a massive procurement of over 11,000 megawatts of power. It specifically said, we need the utilities to buy 1,000 megawatts of long duration storage, not just 4 hours of lithium batteries, and also at least 1,000 megawatts of clean, firm resources, such as geothermal. This is the complement that all credible modeling, in my mind, says is necessary for a heavy solar and wind system. And just to illustrate this further, what happens when you move from a simple LCOE number to start adding integration costs? You may have seen Lazard numbers or Bloomberg New Energy Finance numbers that shows onshore wind, $50 a megawatt hour plus or minus something, or PV, in the 30, 40, 50 range. Once you add batteries to it, here just adding four hours of batteries, you can take that onshore wind number and you might double it with just 4 hours of storage. The PV fixed access number here might double or triple when just you add a 4-hour lithium battery. So this LCOE number cannot be trumpeted to just say, hey, the competition's over, renewables are cheapest, end of discussion. Quite the contrary. Now, I do want to acknowledge dissenting views on this. There are some modelers who say we don't need nuclear, we don't need CCS. They advocate 100% renewable pathways. You're probably familiar with the work of Mark Jacobson out of Stanford, Sven Teske in Australia, a Finnish modeling group at LUT University. They run their models, but they are way out of the mainstream, in my view, way out of what the IPCC says is needed. Their modeling exercises typically require a massive expansion of transmission, huge amounts of battery and thermal storage, and unprecedented load shifting and demand management. But you can dig into this work if you wish. A final note on electricity decarbonization, which I think we need to keep aware of, is to ask what are governments actually planning to do, not just modelers. And when you look at the long-term strategies that governments have submitted to the UNFCCC, laying out their visions on how to sharply reduce emissions or get all the way to net zero, well, WRI looked at the first 29 submitted. We have a publication on this. 18 countries indicate they plan to use CCS to reduce emissions from fossil energy sources. 6 more were considering it. 16 of those countries indicated they plan to use nuclear generation. And when you zoom in on the larger economies, and when I've looked at more than 29 countries now, 5 of the G7 countries have nuclear in their long-term strategy. 9 of the G20 countries have nuclear in their official long-term strategy. And 5 additional G20 countries that don't have an LTS yet have nuclear plants under construction or planned expansion. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, India, Russia, Turkey. So we need to keep in mind what governments are actually doing as we think about how, as a globe, do we get to net zero. So I'm going to stop here before moving on to the role of carbon capture. Again, happy to take some questions. They can even be hostile, because I know I'm speaking to Maria, and I've said some things that heartfelt beliefs and widely shared views on how we have to complement these heavy renewable systems of the future with clean, firm.
Joe, do you want to read this one from John?
Sure. What can curb carrot abuse? Whether car dealers are adding $5,000 to a vehicle price, or a home charger installation electrician overcharges for an installation to HVAC installers, knowing tax credits are there, so they bump up the bill.
Mm-hmm.
We have no idea if large institutional programs are affected by graft, in other words, Buffalo Billion. Such actions have happened since the early days of prior incentives. These are disincentive moves, which are legal to do by the actors.
Mm-hmm. This is a great question, and maybe we should add it to the list. I think I listed 4 obstacles in response to a first question. Well, I go all the way back to grad school, Berkeley, 1980s, big solar water heating incentive program by the California PUC. And yeah, we saw solar water heater manufacturers and installers kicking up their price. I don't have a good answer for this, and I'm really glad you posed it, because it's going to make me dig around a little bit. Nor have I seen analysts or journalists covering this yet, either doing much to ask the question or to think of solutions. So I'm going to make a note here. This is something that we really need to think of, as, again, everyone who wants to solve this problem needs to think about gaming and grifting.
Are there any other questions? If not, I'll ask one,
Please.
Carl. I think there are 9 hydrogen hubs being established within the United States. There's ongoing discussion as to where they're going to be, but how big a role is hydrogen in generating heat and thermal energy for systems other than just generating electricity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Views on this are kind of all over the map. But I think that's good in a sense that we can probably find many roles for hydrogen in a zero emission economy. We've mentioned a couple already. You may just want to be able to burn hydrogen in a turbine to help balance supply and demand on a grid. If you have a lot of overgeneration of solar and wind, hydrogen can effectively become a method of storage. Use that extra electricity, that surplus electricity, to run an electrolyzer and store up the hydrogen for any kind of use you might need. In the industrial sector, we're beginning to see the first pilot plants where hydrogen is used to make steel, substituting for fossil fuels. We're starting, and all sorts of high temperature heat applications. We can envision hydrogen substituting for natural gas in the industrial sector. Hydrogen in the transport sector may have some applications, particularly if it is converted to ammonia and becomes a more easily transportable and storable fuel in for transport vehicles. Perhaps not much of a role for in buildings in terms of burning directly.
How about methanation?
Methanation is another possibility. So I remember in the slide I showed earlier, just showing like six different models saying how much will the IRA decrease economy-wide emissions. I remember a slide in that study, which again you can look. You have the link you'll have the link there on the slide. Their projection of how much hydrogen and how it would be produced, green, blue, and other colors, and what end uses it would feed are all over the map. We don't have any certainty, but my instinct is, looking at the big picture, is we need to we need to generate, we need to envision hydrogen as playing lots of roles. It can be a very versatile fuel, and therefore let's build those electrolyzers, create those hubs, get a transport system in place, which is not easy because we can't just run it through the existing natural gas pipelines beyond a certain concentration.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think with that we can, there's another question. Is there any consideration for a near nuclear only solution?
I have not seen anyone propose a nuclear only solution. I think the nuclear industry knows that they have underperformed, to put it lightly. Particularly in this country and in some other industrialized countries like the UK, we've had a terrible experience with building the current generation. Think of Vogel, think of Hinkley in the UK. On the other hand, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians appear to have been able to keep costs at a very reasonable level, and have been leading exporters lately. There are very promising SMR designs. In fact, TVA recently committed to a 300 megawatt sort of large SMR, a large small modular reactor, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and whether GE Hitachi can get an order book that lets them achieve the economies of scale and the learning that could make that affordable. But even in the rosiest scenarios, no one is in my experience is projecting that nuclear can or should supply 60, 70, 80, 90% of global generation. No, it can be a very useful complement to a solar and wind system, where again we can take advantage of 2 and 3 cent solar, 3-4 cent wind, or wherever those prices come down, as long as we can maintain a reliable grid and keep the entire grid affordable. Because again, you can imagine the interaction. If we choose stupid pathways that drive electricity prices sky high, that will make the electrification of end uses extremely difficult. It will also undermine public support for strong climate policies that help us solve this problem. So we can never ignore the affordability and the reliability issue and just kind of wish it away. It's integral to achieving decarbonization, integral to maintaining the political support for the policies that will get us there.
Okay. Do you have time for one more, or should we go on, Phil? What do you think? Any comments?
Let's take one more question, and then we'll.
Okay, so Alan has this: is there enough fossil fuel to supply the energy that is needed to build the new electrical infrastructure that is needed?
Oh, absolutely, yes. We are still, sadly, in a way, drowning in fossil fuels. We keep finding creative ways. I mean, when you look at the unconventional oil and gas production revolution over the last 10 to 15 years, we turn loose our geologists and our engineers. They can find smaller and smaller concentrations to bring up in economical ways. We're still sitting on a ton of unburned coal. And in fact, one of my favorite illustrations of the last 30 years is when I was a graduate student, we were worried about running out of energy. Remember those days? Or high school. I was in high school, the first oil crisis, the second oil crisis. We were all worried about running out of energy. That's wrong. We're not running out of energy in any form. We're running out of atmospheric space to dump the CO2 from burning fossil fuels.
Exactly.
That's the existential problem.
Exactly. Our carbon clocks are, there's plenty of carbon in the ground. We just can't burn it.
Yeah.
Okay, I think with that, we probably should move on, Karl.
Fourth strategy, the role of carbon capture. This is also, there is controversy around this. Let's explore this. First, just to recap, the IRA, reflecting the views of most Democrats and President Biden, they bumped up the tax incentives for various forms of carbon capture. To use it, say in a product or for enhanced oil recovery, you get $60 a ton. You capture it and just plug it into the ground in a saline aquifer, you get 85 a ton. If you capture it out of the air through a method like direct air capture, a very generous subsidy of 180 a ton to really try to kickstart these technologies. Why? Why spend all that money? Well, I'm going to explain it by, again, turning to the sixth assessment report, lays out the global emission pathways that can keep us to 1.5 or 2 degrees as a globe. And if you're a skeptic on the need for carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal, I hope I can change your mind. So this figure from the work group from AR6 shows gigatons of CO2 emissions globally, just CO2, not all greenhouse gases, and shows us where we have been continuing to grow from 2020 to 2000 to 2020, and where we need to be by 2100 to maintain a safe climate. These purple and lavender areas represent roughly 500 different scenarios that the IPCC looked at that can keep us at 1.5 degrees. These dotted and solid lines are illustrative mitigation pathways. But however you cut this, however you slice this, we have to get on this incredible, of course, downward path of emissions over the next 30 years. The really daunting aspect of this is that by mid-century and beyond mid-century, 2080, 2100, we are likely going to need to turn global emissions negative. We'll have to somehow be taking out more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we are emitting. And the IPCC report indicates that to bend the curve that steeply over the next years, we're going to need carbon capture and storage to reduce emissions in industry, potentially in the power sector too. And then we're also going to need carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. We're going to have to offset the effect of any residual CO2 we're still emitting. Maybe in 2050, we're still flying planes with jet fuel. We're going to have to offset that and take CO2 out of the atmosphere. We're going to have to offset the effect of residual emissions from the non-CO2 gases, like methane, nitrous oxide, and the industrial F gases. We know how to reduce these, but we don't know how to take them to zero. There will still be several gigatons of non-CO2 gases that we'll have to offset. And finally, and kind of scary, but we got to face the music here, if we overshoot a temperature that we consider safe, overshoot 1.5, actually pretty likely, overshoot 2 degrees, over time, we will have to lower GHG concentrations to cool the planet back down. will have to take CO2 out. That's why I put this big arrow here. We're going to need to go to net negative emissions, and that's going to require carbon dioxide removal by nature-based means and or technological means. How can we do that? This graphic sort of displays the range of methods we can envision to take CO2 out of the air. There's first the nature-based CDR, growing trees, improving farm practices to store more CO2 in the soil. These are great. They're ready now. There are large co-benefits to doing it, but there's also challenges. Working with multiple landholders, some of them very small. Often it's hard to measure exactly how much we're putting in. And also, most frightening is the risk of loss. This is not necessarily permanent. We are seeing so many forests go up in flames around the world. It's frightening. But we can still push on nature-based solutions to the greatest extent possible. On the technology side, these are more under development. Direct air capture, literally pulling air through by fans through an industrial facility that captures the CO2, pulls it out of the air, concentrates it, pumps it underground. There may be some ways we can use CO2, carbon fibers, cement aggregates, etc., that pretty much permanently store it. There may be also ways we could grow dedicated crops and do bioenergy with CCS, pull the CO2 out of the air, burn it, but capture the CO2, pump it in the ground. And there's other things, research underway, there are other options where we might use enhanced mineralization using rocks. We might be able to develop ways to use the oceans to enhance CO2 capture. But the key thing here to note is that at best, we can probably do a few billion tons a year with nature-based solutions. However, the total CDR requirement could easily be 5, 10, 20 billion tons, gigatons a year, which will exceed the physical potential of nature-based solutions. So it's absolutely incumbent on us to push nature-based solutions to the max, but also develop technological-based approaches. There are dissenting views on this. I've pasted several of my favorite headlines here. MIT Technology Review, carbon removal is hype. It's a dangerous distraction. Sierra Club, open letter, it's time to end the carbon capture of climate policy. Don't do it. New York Times op-ed, every dollar spent on this climate technology is a waste. And if you want to read, I think, the strongest argument, flagship paper on why we shouldn't do this at all, is a paper by the Center for International Environmental Law saying this doesn't work. It's too expensive. It's too risky. If we deploy carbon capture on industry and power, if we deploy technology or carbon dioxide removal, it poses a moral hazard question. By inventing it, it will just prolong our dependence on fossil fuels. I respectively disagree. I can't say that the moral hazard question is just a non sequitur. No, if we develop this, we better use it intelligently. But if we develop this technology and just fritter away and keep burning fossil fuels and not reduce our emissions, then we are probably actually the stupidest species on the planet. Sort of in sum, I like to use the metaphor of betting on climate solutions. Should we place all of our chips just on renewables and nature-based CDR? And by the way, the opponents of technological CDR are perfectly fine with nature-based CDR, growing trees, soils, etc. Are the risks of nuclear power unacceptable? Should we just leave all the fossil fuels in the ground starting now? No carbon capture, technological CDR off the table? Or should we spread our chips on a broader portfolio? Not everything is going to work as intended. One of the earlier questions said, what's going to hit a technological obstacle or an economic obstacle or a political obstacle? We don't know. There's still a ton of uncertainties out there. in my view, and I think this is consistent with the IPCC report and certainly what the Biden administration is doing, is spread your chips over a broad portfolio of technologies and use everything that works. So summing up, we have to lower energy demand. We have to be very efficient. We should electrify everything we can think of and make hydrogen and other low-cost, zero-carbon fuels to fill the niches that we can't electrify. Over the next 30 years, we need to double or triple electricity generation, convert it to all zero carbon, build out solar and wind aggressively, particularly this decade when integration costs will remain low. But at the same time, build more transition, build more batteries, use demand management, keep existing nuclear plants operating if they're safe, create new clean firm options, nuclear, CCS, geothermal, invent that long-term electricity storage that's right now still on the horizon. And finally, commercialize carbon capture for various uses in industry and also for the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Spread your chips. Appreciate it. We have about 15 minutes left for discussion and questions. Again, appreciate this chance to be with you all.
Well, thank you so much, Karl. Really very thought-provoking. Challenging, lots of challenges ahead. So there are a couple of questions here. This says, fix the problem of too much CO2. Too many people reduce the size of the world population. It's already happening in many countries. Increase the size of forests, etc. The rainforest is still being reduced. Plant more trees. But I think you just said that planting trees, there's not enough Mother Earth to solve the problem, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely correct. The sadly, just to meet any of those IPCC pathways that I put up there, we have to stop deforestation. We have to plant a lot of trees. That's all sort of baked into these scenarios. And there are programs underway at the government level. WRI is very active in this area, trying to stop the burning of peatlands, deforestation, trying to encourage reforestation. It will help, but it is not enough to achieve the scale of carbon dioxide removal that we are very likely to need.
Okay. Joe, you want to get the next one here?
Sure. Is there a plan to burn the fossil fuels we have to provided? Let me start that again. Is there a plan to burn the fossil fuels we have to provided the energy we need to build the infrastructure without putting too much carbon, too much CO2 in the air? It is a balancing act. Can it be done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, I think it can be done. I think the IPCC has charted a number of courses we could take. There's some variation in them, but they have those four themes that I mentioned of be efficient, electrify, zero carbon electricity, and carbon capture and carbon removal. Interestingly, if you dig into the IPCC report, you'll see that they don't create scenarios where fossil fuels just disappear by 2030. That's simply infeasible. What they do show over 30 years is a rapid and almost complete phase out of coal by 2050, a slower phase down of oil use, and an even slower phase down of natural gas. This makes intuitive sense. Obviously, coal is the most carbon-intensive fuel. So none of this can be done overnight. But we can start with the electricity sector, decarbonize that first. The sector that will go probably next fastest is transportation, where there's rapid turnover of vehicles compared to buildings or factories. and we know how to electrify a lot of transport. And then finally, bringing up the rear will probably be buildings and industry, where the transitions and the stock turnover will go slower. But it is doable, and we don't have to worry about the fossil fuel energy needs of building that infrastructure. That's all baked in. We can make this transition over 30 years if we marshal the political will to put the policies in place that can get us there.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions?
I have a question. I'm trying to write it down to see if it makes sense. With all the recent wildfires in Western US, Canada, Greece, is there a general rule of thumb in terms of what an acre of burned forest contributes to carbon in the atmosphere, and also what an acre of lost forest contributes to the reduction in pulling or capturing carbon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have that at the tip of my tongue. My deepest expertise is in electricity. A second deepest expertise is in transport, and probably the land use aspects of this problem is my weakest suit in the card deck. But there,
No problem.
I'll see if I can direct you to some WRI sources on that. We have the world's sharpest researchers on land use and forestry.
Thank you.
So the next one is the ideas of the company TerraPower sound good on paper. Any thoughts on their nuclear design? It sounds like it would be great if it works.
Mm-hmm. I've skimmed a little bit about TerraPower as I've tried to stay abreast of developments in nuclear power. It's one of at least a dozen designs by various companies. This one, if I recall correctly, particularly interesting because it can help us manage the spent fuel problem and essentially use that spent fuel as the power source. I believe they're going to have their first plant in Wyoming, if memory serves right. But again, we're seeing innovation in this field. I mentioned the GE Hitachi plant. There's also NewScale and Oklo. Each design is a little different, but they tend to have inherently safe designs, meaning that you don't need a diesel generator to keep the pumps flowing. There'll be a design feature that eliminates that need as far as safety, and they also hope to achieve economies of scale by standardizing the design and being able to build components in factories and ship them to sites rather than building everything on site as kind of a one-off. So again, something to keep our eyes on and hope they succeed.
So what's the role of fuel cells in the future, Karl?
Mm-hmm. I don't see a lot of talk about fuel cells in sort of the latest round of modeling and studies. They of course, I think were originally developed for the space program and can produce electricity from various fuel sources. They are probably going to be a niche application, perhaps in some transport end uses, maybe some balancing of the grid, but not. I don't have in-depth knowledge on fuel cells, but I'm not seeing a lot of discussion in them in these mitigation scenario reports.
Okay. I'll talk to you offline about there's some pretty major opportunities, I think, in fuel cell technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Here comes one. Outstanding speaker and presentation. Thank you for the excellent presentation. How about some questions, folks?
I'm talking to Maria. I'm wondering if anyone, wants to push back on, what I've said about the need to complement renewables. There may, I hope what I've said makes sense, but again, there's a range of views out there, and some people make the judgment that, for instance, nuclear power, the risks are just too great. Take it off the table. Or the risks of carbon capture are too great. Take it off the table. There are people who advocate for those positions, or perhaps again, the floor is open.
Well,
I'll just make a comment from something that, again, I just was reading the other day, which is some of these startup companies with direct air capture are talking about $100 to $150 a ton, which means they're actually making money just from the incentive to build the plant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The best of my knowledge, I think they are talking about the cost they could ultimately get to, unless they've had a breakthrough. Like literally some of the first plants are coming in at like 500 or 600 a ton. And there have been studies, like engineering studies, that say at a certain scale, with some learning, mass production of these things, we could get down to 200. Could we get down to 150 or 100? So that's not that plant is not operating now, but one can hope that we do get down to that low cost carbon removal approach.
Okay, fair enough.
Carl, in the area of nuclear, it's not just the safety issue, but there's been this difficulty of the speed at which you can build the plants and deploy, and at the rate at which we need to be reducing our emissions. It seems like the major argument that I'm seeing is that wind and solar are deployable right now, and it's a matter of perhaps they're not being used efficiently, but they're available and producible, and in short lead times. One thing that I haven't seen much in this is onshore wind. We've been staking a lot of our interest in the offshore wind, which I think is very appropriate. It's the most stable and steady source of it. But it seemed like we were on I know in Pennsylvania, we were on a pretty strong clip towards onshore wind, and that program just pretty much died. We're not seeing much wind being built in Pennsylvania anymore. Some of that's shifted to other states. I know it's a lot more predominant in the Midwest, but are there incentive plans in the IRA that address onshore wind?
Yes, there's the current production tax credit for wind stays in place till 2025, and then it switches over to again a generous subsidy incentive for all zero carbon electricity, including wind. So that'll cover onshore, offshore. I think what you have, what you've seen is that some of between the good sites and the politically acceptable sites, particularly in the Northeast, have been built.
Yeah.
And what we and again, the richness of the wind resource was never that great out east. You look at the NREL maps, and it's that big swath through the Great Plains that has the huge wind potential, and then the offshore on both coasts. And so the way to tap into that, of course, is number one, overcome the any political opposition, and second, build the transmission lines that can wheel power from the Great Plains to the urban load centers, and et cetera. And I'll just use this to tee off a little bit just on this idea of spreading your chips. Nuclear. Will there be a revival? I don't know for sure. There may be continued political opposition to siting. Okay, but at least create the commercial option. Offshore wind, it's a great resource. It's more expensive than onshore, but looks like we could come in at a reasonable rate. I'm seeing, tremendous opposition up and down the Jersey Shore from local communities to offshore wind. Are they going to succeed in blocking offshore wind? Are they going to succeed in blocking the underwater cables or the online connection? Maybe, maybe not. Solar. We know the potential for solar to grow tremendously is great, and yet some of the big solar farms that are being proposed on agricultural land are hitting political obstacles. We're going to need, in my view, probably a little bit of all of this. And again, the mixture is going to depend on how does the technology ultimately develop? What do the economics look like? Does it come in cheap or expensive? Fine. If you have those two in place, then you have the political challenge. Do you have the transmission lines? Is it okay to see the windmills on the horizon of the ocean? Is it okay to have a big solar farm in the desert, even though it's going to impact, this or that species? To pull major options off the table right now, to me, is not prudent. So let's move all of these up, to the commercialization point, and try to build the consensus around enough of them that we can go forward and create all of that big supply of zero carbon electricity that will essentially be powering the rest of the economy.
So there's one more here, Karl. There's a couple of questions around geothermal, and particularly the use of fracking technology, extended geothermal. And there's a lot of potential for geothermal, even in the United States, where the low-grade heat can be utilized effectively. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, there are very positive signs just in the last year or two of some breakthroughs in geothermal. And again, applying some of the same technological breakthroughs like horizontal drilling that have enabled the unconventional oil and gas revolution. We can apply those to tapping geothermal heat in a much broader area than just little pockets of California or Indonesia, et cetera, or Iceland. So that's moving forward. I'd encourage you to go to Dave Roberts' blog and podcast on this. He just had a guy on the show from the company I think called Fervo. So this is promising. It's clean, firm. It could be a great complement to a heavy solar and wind thing. But also, there could be some environmental impacts that we have to manage from this, just as that fracking has created apparently sometimes induces minor tremors. Geothermal might do the same. I'm not enough of an expert to know that, but we also have to acknowledge that every energy source is going to have some environmental impacts. We're losing birds to windmills. We can't take that to zero. Geothermal might have impacts. Solar, just the mining of materials, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel. We're going to have to accept some environmental impacts. We'll try to minimize it, but it doesn't go away when we decarbonize.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Karl. We're going to move on now to the connections portion of our
Thank
meeting.
you, and I'll send you my deck. And thanks everyone for attending. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Karl. Very fascinating. Thank you very much.